Hey, everybody. I am Nancy Becher, the president and founder of Invisible Warriors. Welcome to Silent Strength with Invisible Warriors, a podcast dedicated to honoring the extraordinary women veterans who have faced the profound challenges of PTS and military sexual trauma. Our journey began with a simple yet powerful mission to give voice to those whose strength often goes unseen. We believe in the power of stories to heal, connect, and transform. This podcast is a space where women veterans can share their experiences, offering hope and solidarity to others navigating similar paths. Each episode delves into the unique and personal stories of courageous women, highlighting their resistance, their resilience, and the battles they continue to fight long after their service has ended. We bring in expert voices to provide insights and strategies, creating a deeper understanding of the complexities these veterans face. Silent Strength with Invisible Warriors is more than just a podcast. It's a community where listeners can find support and inspiration. For veterans adjusting to life after service, or for those who wish to stand with them, our podcast is an invitation to listen, learn, and grow together. We are committed to breaking the silence surrounding emotional well-being and military sexual trauma, creating a platform where these critical conversations can thrive. It's about acknowledging the unseen scars and celebrating the strength it takes to overcome them. Today, we are honored to have a guest who will share their journey, shedding light on challenges and triumphs they've encountered and they've seen in the world around them. Join us in this vital dialogue and discover the power of shared experiences. Together, we can build a network of understanding and support, ensuring that no veteran feels alone on their journey. Welcome, Lisa Dinhofer, to Silent Strength with Invisible Warriors. We're glad you're
Thank,
here.
thank you, Nancy. I'm delighted to be here with you and all of your listeners.
Lisa, tell us a little bit about who you are and what brought you here.
Well, my background, I'm a certified thanatologist. That's someone who specializes in death and grief and loss from both physical death losses as well as non-death losses. I've had a subspecialty in traumatic loss for 20 plus years. I'm also a certified trauma-informed coach and consultant. I'm a trained counselor and a specialist in crisis communication. And the reason why I'm here is because I heard you had a need, and I said, I'll do it. And so that's why I'm here today to have a conversation with you in the hopes that whatever I bring forward can be of usefulness and service to those who are listening today.
And I thank you very much for stepping forward and saying you'd be here for us. Unfortunately, for so many of these women, that's not something that they're used to. They're not used to someone being on their side in their corner and saying, "We're here to listen. We're here to do what we can to help." And I know that we've talked in multiple meetings about trauma and what the women go through and how for each person trauma can be different, how it affects them, how they deal with it. And I know from talking to these women, for many of them, it doesn't really matter what happened to start the whole journey for them. It's the fact that it did happen and they're not receiving any support from anyone, including their closest family members. You know, when they were in the military, they couldn't reach out and tell anybody anything, and they're embarrassed now. They don't know what's going on. In a meeting that we had the other day, one of our women says, I've been out of the military for over 20 years, and I just now am realizing that I'm dealing with MST. So they
Right,
don't even acknowledge it to themselves. And what
right.
must that do to their psyches and to their bodies? Because these emotional things that go on also affect them physically.
Yeah,
Am I right?
absolutely. Trauma lives in the body. It's a brain thing. Trauma is actually a wound. in the brain, um, and but also it lives in the body. And I would make the provocative statement that before whatever trauma your listeners experience in the military, they already had trauma in their background. Most people um, will have at least one traumatic experience in their lives before their lives end. And most often, trauma starts within the family of origin when they're very young. And whatever coping mechanisms that came forward at that time, those coping mechanisms tend to get stuck and frozen. Like trauma is like a piece of ice within you that contains information. It blocks information between people. It impacts every relationship in your life. It will impact how you communicate and navigate in the world. And when people say I got triggered, it's really a reactivation of trauma that's already there and that has not been resolved. And you were in front of some kind of stimulation or sequelate that picked at that wound. And so that intelligence that helped keep you safe at the time when that trauma was happening comes forward even though it's no longer necessary, right? So we keep repeating these behaviors over and over and over. What really came forward for me when I learned about you and your group and the fact that you call it invisible warriors, that's so resonant with what trauma is. Trauma is very much, as we've all heard, the invisible wound, but it can even be invisible to the person who's wounded. They don't realize that behavioral characteristics is actually is actually a trauma response, right? We think trauma is, we still don't, the general public still has a very stereotypical view of what trauma is and what it supposedly looks like. Not every trauma is a big T trauma like a car accident. There are a lot of little T traumas, and actually, a constellation of little T traumas is just as damaging as a big T trauma, right? And we're
Made more
seeing,
so.
yeah, and we're seeing more and more kids with that. And compound trauma means you've had more than one successive episode with that. But when I began thinking about you and your group, what came forward for me is there is, I think, an extra layer for women in the military who've been traumatized by their military service if they were, you know, in war theater and or sexual trauma within the military on base or wherever that was. The context around that, I think, is very important and additionally wounding. So let me help you understand what I mean by that. You know, when you are part of the armed forces, you are literally property of the armed forces. They own you, right? So, and that dictates every single thing, what you look like, if you're a man, if you can have facial hair or not, what's your hairstyle, what it can be, the clothes you wear and when, the places you can go and when, where you're going to live, the lack of agency about where you're going to live and when you have to move. And I mean, it encompasses every part of your life until you're out of that service. And you're being asked to sign up for an activity that very definitely could involve the ultimate sacrifice, aside from having to constantly move around and all of that, the loss of your life, and to go into warfare and battle, right? So that's a lot of sacrifice for you and your family, but it's a huge sacrifice in exchange for, and that's where I see the additional layer here, in exchange for the notion that you are part of a community that looks out for one another. When you're in war theater, you have to have each other's backs in order to survive and go home that day. And it's not just in war theater, it's when you're on base and when you are actively serving this country through this organization called the Armed Forces. So the contract, the agreement is I'm going to make all these sacrifices for you in exchange for a paycheck that doesn't begin to meet livable wage standards now and all of that, but also in exchange for safety. If I agree to do this, you're going to train me to be safe, and I'm going to be within a community that will keep me safe and look after me, whether I'm in war theater or not. And when I experience some of the worst kinds of violations by my peers who are supposed to have my back, the betrayal is another aspect of trauma that is not necessarily present in other kinds of trauma experiences. The ultimate betrayal. And then on top of that, the very intentional, subtle, and overt messaging, you better not talk about this or else. We're going to hurt your family. We're going to hurt you further. You will be marginalized. You cannot leave until you're discharged or you voluntarily leave. So we're going to make life even worse for you until we kick you out or you decide to leave and make further sacrifices on what leaving early means. So to me, this is a very multi-layered, multi-dimensional trauma that doesn't really get talked about a lot when I hear just in general, and I'm not immersed in a military community, but just what I've heard, this aspect of that betrayal isn't talked about nearly as much as the actual, trauma itself, whether it
And
was
there's
physical.
another, if I can interrupt you for a second, there's still another layer for the women. Not only are they dealing with all of that within the military itself, but if they take a step out into the community at large, simple things like take a free lunch on Veterans Day, where the woman and her husband go to have something to eat. And the waitress says to the man, "Well, your meal's free today. Here's your bill," and hands the woman the bill. And it may be that both were in the military. It may be that the woman was in the
Mhm.
military. But the women get no respect whatsoever. They'll park in a handy or in a military spot at Costco's, and someone will come running up to them and say, "Hey, that's for somebody who served." And they'll go, "Excuse me, but I served." You know,
Yeah.
and and so you've not only got all of this crap going on in the service, but you've got a total ignorance outside, which makes it that much worse.
Well, the ignorance is based on invisibility. And so we get back to the whole issue about invisibility, which again is that multi-layered, multi-dimensional. Um, I would say, not being recognized as a veteran if you're not in uniform when you're out there, that's disrespectful and it's frustrating, which is adjacent to the kind of trauma that so it compounds,
Mhm.
right? It's a compounding factor, but I think it's also very important, as Dr. Danny Siegel talks about, and Danny Siegel is a big guy in the trauma world, and especially with kids, says when you can name it, you can tame it. So when we can name all of the aspects and we can identify, okay, what is part of my trauma and what is part of just what pisses me off all the time, and how veterans are treated in general in our country,
Mhm.
it helps the person who's struggling to cognitively organize what they're coping with, right? So what can easily happen when you're in Costco's parking lot and some know-it-all person comes running up and says, "You can't park there, you're not a veteran." The response can be um, extremely exaggerated and unhelpful to you because of the trauma piece. Do you see what I'm saying here? Right?
Absolutely.
So it is really important for us to understand our responses and what filters they come through. And trauma responses are involuntary. It's not that we say to ourselves, I think that I'll go into an absolute meltdown rage right now. It's not a choice, right? So trauma is not a choice. Our brain designates conditions to be a threat. Our brain is hardwired to identify threat at all times. Now, there's a spectrum of threats. So, stress is considered a threat by our brain. And then we go all the way to the end of that spectrum where you are actually in a life-threatening situation. But the brain and the body will start doing the same things when it registers a threat. It's going to go into the sympathetic activation response where our central nervous system goes into high gear. So our thinking processes leave the frontal cortex of our brain and now goes back into the amygdala where everything is about reactivity in order to save ourselves. That's the brain's response. And when that's happening, the brain and the body are doing things in unison to help us. So all these stress chemicals are beginning to cascade through our body. And again, this is not voluntary. This happens. And our brain and our body goes through this process that it's hardwired to do to keep us safe. The problem is that we're not meant to live in this state as a lifestyle, as so many of us are now, because our stressors are just chronic and recurrent and nonstop. It's meant to help us out for about 20, 30 minutes when we run away from that saber-toothed tiger. Because after about 30 minutes, you're either that tiger's lunch or you've gotten away.
Mhm.
But we continually are in circumstances that trip our brain to register what we're in as a threat, and our brain and our body maladapts, right? It's not meant to be turned on like this and dysregulated hour after hour after hours, but it continues to step up to the plate and respond, but it will maladapt. And this is where we start having a lot of physical, medical issues as well as cognitive issues. What do I mean by cognitive issues? So when we've been under acute stress for a long time or longer than what's healthy, simple things like word retrieval, you can't find the word, you can't think of, you know it, but it fails you. And the reason that happens is there are these little filaments in our brain that connect everything. They look like little threads. And when we're under chronic stress, and if you're experiencing post-traumatic stress, those filaments become brittle and they snap. And so there are literally parts of our brain that are no longer connecting the way they used to. And that's why we have word retrieval issues. We have concentration issues. We have brain fog issues, right? Another outcome to being under chronic stress is a lowering of our tolerance for frustration. Even the smallest little thing will just set us off. That's living with a dysregulated central nervous system. And it's why trauma, unresolved trauma, and acute chronic stress, they really are dangers not only to our well-being, but our lives, because that kind of chronic living state will cut our lives short. And then when you're in Costco's parking lot and this stupid person says this to you, rather than turning around and saying, "Excuse me, I served in the military for X number of years," perhaps you ought to think twice before you say that the next time
Yeah.
in a calm voice and you smile and you walk away. You just have a meltdown that, gets them calling the police. And the pandemic, we're still living through the legacy of when you are in a chronic crisis. It's known as crisis fatigue, right? So our ability to, again, tolerate frustration and self-regulation, being able to control ourselves and respond in a controlled manner, it's diminished. And we're still experiencing that. We're not past the legacy of that pandemic. So for your listeners, I want to first say, you're not making this up. You're not being a weenie. You're not embellishing. Something has happened to you. And you are also part of the collective stuff that has happened to everyone here in this country. But you also have these other things that are simultaneous to that. Trauma is very real and it's disruptive and it does not play fair, but it is not a terminal disease. And it's why I'm delighted to see after we had a conversation, you told me that you took the D away from post-traumatic stress because an awful lot of us in this space have been saying for a long time, it's not a disorder. A disorder is something that can't be cured. You can manage it, but it can't be cured. Post-traumatic stress, we absolutely know can be not just mitigated, but resolved with the right kinds of treatments for as long as you need those treatments to eradicate it.
And is there, when we talk about treatments, I know that there's a lot of different things out there and different, the VA. I've heard more than I can count the number of times that the women are saying, well, all the VA wants to do is give me medicines. I don't want medicines. I want
Right,
treatment,
right.
and
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
that there are my husband who has degrees in trauma and stress and peer support and counseling and all those things. I have a master's degree in counseling. So, we've all been trained with certain things. And I have PTSD. It has nothing to do with the military. I was in a couple of really bad car accidents,
mhm,
and I am petrified of getting into the car and driving down a busy road anymore. And
yeah.
my husband's training has him saying, well, you need to do this. You need to, you've got to be in the car. You've got to go. You've got to do this and that and the other thing. We got to. And I'm going, that's not helping me. So I know that there are different
Yes. There are different
ways you can,
modalities
yeah.
because people are not cars, right? They're not all alike. And not all trauma affects us the way it does other people. And some people can go through a car accident and be very rattled about it, but long term, they're perfectly okay to get back in that car or back on a plane or whatever. Others, it stops you in your tracks. You become paralyzed at the thought of it. And
Mhm.
so when that happens, that you can't get in the car or you can't get on the plane or whatever, that is actually a notification coming from your body, from where that trauma is living, saying, hey, this, you got to take care of this. This is still here. Okay, I need some help here, right? Um, so I'm a very, very big believer in EMDR modality treatment. I'm trained in it. I'm not a licensed therapist. I just, even though I'm a trained counselor, I didn't go the therapy route for a whole lot of reasons. But I went through the training and I went all the way through to advanced training. And part of the training is you have to go through it yourself. And I'll be honest with you, I was skeptical about it when I went in because I'm a death and grief and loss person. And I thought, yeah, this isn't going to work for that. And I was so, so, so wrong. And when I got to the end of that training, I realized that we were all asked to say, what have you learned or what are you taking away? And what I said to the instructor was, no one has to walk around wounded, right? So it's not that I'm against medication. I'm not. I think we need to be really careful about these broad brush statements. And everything is either yes or no. Life is rarely, a bifurcation. It's rarely yes or no. There's a lot of gray. But the whole purpose of medication was to be used as a tool to take the edge off to help you in your treatment, not just necessarily be a standalone treatment. For some people, that may be enough. But then we get very dependent on something external to ourselves, right? And with the ridiculousness of what we call a healthcare system, you're at risk of your own well-being is at risk if you can't have access to that medication, right? So I'm a big believer in mind-body modalities because trauma is a mind-body issue, right? And talk therapy only accesses the left side of the brain. And when we have these trauma issues, that's in another part of our brain that EMD can access, kind of jiggles it loose and allows it to go over to the left side so then it can be processed through that talk therapy. So I also know that what some people may call alternative, like psilocybin and ayahuasca and some of those psychedelic approaches are having very, very good response. I have a therapist friend who got so disgusted with what's going on here. She moved out of the country and is somewhere else, and she's having excellent response using some of those psychedelics with people with post-traumatic stress and gender violence stress and trauma. So I would say that when it comes to treatment, have an open mind. Be open to learning about new things and seeking more information and even seeking out credentialed providers of these things, because that for you may be what helps you turn the corner.
Yeah. I think it's very, very important that you're able to, and if you go to a doctor or a therapist or a counselor, and for whatever reason it's not a fit, that it's
Right.
okay to go look elsewhere. And
And
if
when
you,
that, and what I really want to say there is when you're in that situation where you feel this physician, this provider, whatever, is not a good fit for me, I encourage your listeners today, stand in your sovereignty with that. Do not seek external validation to allow yourself to approve what you're already thinking. That approval process comes from within, your inner authority. You don't need this provider to convince you that they're the right ones for you, right? You make that choice and you get to decide the criteria on making that choice. Even if you just don't feel comfortable in this person's presence, trust me, as a therapeutic relationship, that is everything. Even if you can't put your finger on it, I don't feel comfortable in the presence of this person. That's enough. That is enough. And it maybe you've also been working with someone for a long time and you feel that you've hit a plateau. Well, you don't stay with a provider out of loyalty. This isn't a personal relationship. This is a therapeutic relationship. So what I encourage people to remember is that this person served you for a time that got you to where you are now. Well, now you're ready and prepared to jump to the next lily pad for the next phase of work. It's not that you're throwing this person away. It's not that you're not grateful or whatever, but we don't always stay the same. Progress is about movement, right? So there are people who can help you get to this point, then their role with you is done. It's not that their expertise is diminished, it's that their role with you has come to a natural conclusion, and you now have to take the steering wheel and go in the next direction. If you're waiting for someone to validate that for you, you will suffer.
yeah,
Stand in your
unfortunately,
sovereignty.
yeah, unfortunately, when we're talking in the military, this is going to need some work because for most
I
of
know they
us,
have you stuck. They have you stuck in a system that's dysfunctional, which is why I encourage people to do research and get information that extends beyond the confines of that very dysfunctional system.
yeah,
Because just because the military forces you to use those providers, at the end of the day, you will be the ones making the decisions of who you want to, and I use this word literally, submit your mind and your body to.
yeah. And one of the ways that you might best move out of a situation such as that when you're dealing with the military, I know that in Alabama, we have some very good governmental representatives at both the federal and the state level. And they are very concerned about how military personnel are treated. And if you go to them and you say, look, this is the situation, they can help. They
Right.
can.
It's about advocating for yourself. And of course, the first place of advocacy is knowledge.
Right.
You have to know what you need and what's missing and what's out there in order to advocate for yourself or for anyone else. So
Right.
yes, I understand the confines and the dictates of the VA and the military, and but also you can still continue to look for something other than or adjunctive to. No one says you can't do the research and you can't find out and you can't advocate for yourself. The pity of it is that you
Yeah.
have to advocate for yourself because the system is structured to wear people out in order to be a cost savings measure on how much they're going to spend,
Yeah. So,
which
but
is
it's just keep going, keep trying,
right.
don't give up, I think is the
And
last.
and the gaslighting around, you know, that's such an insidious enemy is being gaslit by people who have more authority than you do or more power than you do. And so I go back to stand in your sovereignty. You
I love
know what you're experiencing and know the truth of what's happening for you and who you are and advocate for who you are, not what a dysfunctional system will allow you.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. I could go on talking and listening to you for 2 hours more, but unfortunately, our time is up. I hope that maybe you'll come back again and we can further
Absolutely.
look at this in the future. But for now, thank you so much for all of the wonderful information. It's a lot to think about, and I know that my listeners will walk away from this feeling much better about the situation that they're in. So,
Do
is there
you want
any
to
last? Mhm.
yeah, if people would like to reach out to me personally, is that something your group here
Absolutely.
allows?
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah, so for sure, if people want to reach out to me, I do a lot of coaching in this area, so you can reach out to me at the website and the email that I'll post or Nancy will post, and you can reach out to me through there, and I'd be happy to talk
That's
to you.
that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa.
You're
And
welcome.
as of right now, you have been listening to Silent Strength with Invisible Warriors. And if you haven't already, please give us a quick review and ratings on iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube. To wrap things up, often after a podcast, people want to know more about some of the things that we're doing at Invisible Warriors. And if you'd like to hop on a Zoom, my contact information is in the show notes and it's on the website at invisiblewarriors.org. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to today's conversation, and we will see you soon. Bye bye, y'all.